You are listening to Over and Back's Basketball Mysteries of the 1970s. Today's mystery is, why doesn't the ABA's history officially count? We are brought to you today by The Replay with Elle and Al. Have you ever wondered how your favorite NBA players spend their time off the court? If so, The Replay with Elle and Al is a perfect podcast for you. They discuss everything from endorsement deals and power couples to fashion choices and social media. Listen in every week and we promise you'll be hipper than Joel Embiid's pregame dance routines. Check out The Replay on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcasts, or check it out at The Step Back. Hey, this is Jason. Today my guest is Adam Criblez, basketball historian who's been on the show before. He's got a book on the 70s coming out soon, and just want to mention there are a few instances where his voice is slightly distorted, usually at the very beginning of when he speaks. It only happens a handful of times. It might be a little bit annoying, but you should be able to hear basically everything he says. Just wanted to mention that for those who are sensitive to issues. So enjoy the show. So we are talking about the ABA-NBA merger, expansion, absorption, whatever term you want to use. That is what we are talking about. And a lot of interesting aspects to it, but one interesting aspect as historians, I think, is how the ABA's history is treated. And it is not really integrated with the NBA's history. Usually in the official NBA records, Julius Erving, for instance, his NBA stats are counted, but his ABA stats are usually not included with his totals. Obviously, you can go to Basketball Reference and get those and compare him in the history of the official lexicon. But as far as the NBA's official records goes, not really treated, certainly not with equal amount of reverence, if nothing else. That
extends beyond Julius Erving. You guys mentioned, I think you were talking to Curtis about Ron Boone the other couple podcasts ago, and that his even consecutive game streak. So I think it's interesting. It goes beyond just points scored and Dr. J. Yeah, obviously, it goes really for anybody involved in the league. But I mean, obviously, if you just stack up Irving's NBA accomplishments, which are great, Artis Gilmore, somebody like that, and don't include their ABA accomplishments, you don't get the full picture, or much less guys who just played in the ABA, things like that. But so, kind of leading into what's going on in the ABA's final season, it's chaos. There are teams folding, schedule constantly having to be reworked, particularly early in the season. There are 6 somewhat sound teams: the Nuggets, the Nets, the Spurs, the Pacers, the Kentucky Colonels, and the Spirits of St. Louis. However, Baltimore folds before even having played a game, having had moved from Memphis. San Diego folds, Utah folds, both early in the season. Virginia hanging on somewhat by a thread. They do manage to survive the whole season, as Carl Shearer, the Denver Nuggets executive, said it was a death march in many respects. We really had nothing. So obviously the ABA not coming in at a position of strength at the end of that season, really in a very weak position, not likely to be able to survive into the future, and really having to take whatever terms the NBA is willing to give them. I think that actually you can trace it back about a year before then. In 1975, 2 of the ABA teams, 2 of probably the strongest teams, the Denver Nuggets and New York Nets, led by David Thompson and Julius Erving, tried to negotiate a deal to jump just themselves to the NBA. So I think the NBA saw that even the rats were jumping ship. The best teams in the ABA wanted to be in the NBA, and so I think that was kind of the final straw. Maybe the last position of strength the ABA had was they had Dr. J, they had David Thompson, they had Artis Gilmore. But when several of these ABA teams were willing to sell out or to jump leagues, I think that the ABA, even the most ardent ABA supporters had to realize that the end was near.
Absolutely. And, and the NBA was certainly not in a giving mood anyway. There had been a contentious battle, a 9-year battle between the NBA and ABA over free agents, over underclassmen, many lawsuits, many major legal fees. And the entire mission statement of the ABA was to form a league and force a merger, just like the AFL had with the NFL. And the fact that the ABA had survived 9 years, it was really, went way beyond anybody's expectations. Of course, they also thought a merger was going to become much sooner than that, and it almost did. We'll talk about kind of the evolution of that, but the point being is that there were all these battles over players. There was all these accusations over spying, leaks from disgruntled employees. For the most part, the NBA guys didn't like the ABA guys, and the ABA guys didn't really like the NBA guys very much, but were wanted to get into the club and were basically willing to accept almost whatever they could get.
Yeah, I love this quote from the Knicks owner Mike Burke. That you mentioned that not only was the ABA ready to merge, but the NBA was done in too. And he said, "quote: It was time to take off our land because we were out of runway." So I think that's a great metaphor.
Yes, yeah. There's another interesting one as well from Irv Kozlov of the 76ers, who said this is into 75. There must be only one league by whatever method it takes to get it done. So it was at that point, it was the last year of the ABA. They were struggling and, weren't sure if it was going to be a merger or if the league was just going to fail and the NBA would absorb its players. But at that point, obviously they had been, battered by, years of just all these headaches of dealing with the competition and wanting to have at least on the management side, they were just wanting to have a united league. The players, still, I think, were pretty happy with having two leagues. Obviously, it was very beneficial for them, especially in the early years as salaries rise and as the leagues are bidding over guys. But, even by probably by 74, 75, as teams are, folding or there's a constant tension there. And the leagues are struggling in some respects. Probably, even some of the players, at least, were all in favor of a merger as long as, their rights were represented.
That was a constant issue with the ABA and NBA was that competition between the owners, but the players were generally interested in keeping two leagues because it gave them more options. Yeah.
And one thing that I think is interesting is the precedent from the original merger, the NBL and the BAA merging in 1949 to form the original NBA. And the way that was viewed and the way that sort of informs the ABA merger, I think, is interesting because there's definitely a difference of opinion in the sort of the newspaper accounts of the time and of the years later, whether this was two leagues forming one league or whether it was more of a stronger league, the BAA absorbing the weaker one and just changing the name, but it essentially being the BAA. The press accounts of the time are somewhat split, and the NBA, the newly formed NBA, did keep most of the BAA structure, and most of the franchises from the NBL eventually washed out. However, only 3 of the 8 franchises that survived this period of the early 50s, all this turmoil, actually began in the BAA. The other 5 started in the NBL. So, when it comes to the history of the original 8 teams, the NBL was the source of more than the BAA. But over the years, the BAA has become the official precedent league for the NBA, and the NBL records and history have been marginalized. Even the Lakers' NBL title in 1948, a league which included, by the way, the Hawks, the Kings, the Sixers, and the Pistons, teams that, the franchises that would become those teams, that's not counted for the Lakers, toward their number of overall championships. And obviously if you added that one, that that comes closer to the Celtics record of a championship. So those things are somewhat meaningful, even though obviously it's a league from the 40s. Most fans, even fans who are pretty into basketball history, listening to this kind of thing, what does that matter? But it does change some perceptions and change some records, and obviously, if you think of the BAA as the origin league versus thinking of, the BAA kind of took the best NBL teams and eventually those two leagues merged, that's a different, founding view of how the how the original origin of the NBA was founded, and that obviously informs the way that you think of how the ABA and the NBA came together as well, even though those were obviously different circumstances.
Well, I think there's a lot of comparisons actually. One of my favorite basketball historians is a man by the name of Dr. Murray Nelson, who wrote several books about. He wrote one about the American Basketball League, but his book about the National Basketball League is really fascinating. And I had the opportunity to talk to him at a conference a few years ago, and he drew these comparisons between the ABA and the NBL very explicitly. He said, the strongest NBA teams were former NBL teams. In some ways, the ABA, none of the ABA original four won a title in the first several years until, and the Spurs must have been the first, but the Nuggets and Spurs were two of the best teams in the late 70s and early 80s. And then you had in the NBL, the former NBL, Minneapolis Lakers, Rochester Royals, and Syracuse Nationals, who end up, of course, being the Lakers, Kings, and Sixers today. They won the first 6 NBA titles. And then if you look at the all NBA teams, the first couple seasons, they're littered with NBL players. And the comparisons, again, with the ABA are tremendous. And one of the reasons the NBL washed out is they were located in smaller cities. They didn't have a lot of media presence, and similarly the ABA, even those in big cities, couldn't get on TV, couldn't get the publicity. And so I think that you make a great point that there are comparisons between the merger in 1949 and that in 1976.
The way that those legacies were treated as well. I mean, and as far as a national presence, the NBL was nothing, the BAA was nothing, really until the 60s, late 50s, maybe early 60s, where there was any sort of major league sense with what the NBA was. So there wasn't much of a history tradition to really think about and preserve at the time, where, by the 70s, the NBA is more established, and there's considerations of preserving history, considerations of the tradition, and those things matter much more in the situation in 76 than they would have in 49, with both leagues being relatively new and very few people caring about those sorts of things in the original merger. But so looking at the sort of the evolution of the merger, the first really serious talks toward a merger happened in 1970. The league began in 67. The ABA filed an antitrust suit against the NBA in 68 related to NBA collusion in the draft. Some documents were leaked to the ABA from a disgruntled NBA employee, and they basically had a list of proving sort of NBA colluding with its teams to draft players and to get them to kind of the spots that they wanted to, which was illegal under the system, and it was meant to prevent as much ABA interference as they could, because one thing the ABA had managed to do was draft some key players already. So that is kind of that the pressure from that gets the NBA to the negotiating table, and the NBA voters actually vote 13-4 to negotiate toward a merger in 1970. Sam Schulman, who's sort of a renegade owner for the Seattle Supersonics, of course a recent addition to the NBA, went so far as to threaten to jump to the ABA and move the Sonics to Los Angeles if the NBA didn't accept agreement. And there was a tentative vote, a tentative plan that would have admitted all 10 of the 11 ABA teams, all but the Virginia Squires, who were considered too close to the Baltimore Bullets team. But the major thing that really throttled or kept that from happening was the Oscar Robertson antitrust lawsuit, which was filed in 1970. And the Players Association basically wanting to get rid of the reserve clause that tied a player to the team that drafted him, and really was a huge restraint of player rights.
Yeah, and Oscar Robertson really is in many ways the perfect leader for that Players Association at the time. He's a strong personality. He obviously experienced the racism and segregation tracing to his high school days in Indianapolis, and then he comes in and he's an established star. He's got a lot of gravitas, and he's the head of that Players Association. But it really takes a great deal of unification or unified effort from the players to make sure that has teeth. And so those NBA players filing the suit, like you said, effectively keep the merger from taking place until the reserve clause issue is settled. And so it's really, like you said, the reserve clause issue rather than merger that is the sticking point for the next 6 years.
Yeah. And so the NBA, instead of deciding to absorb the ABA or merge with the ABA, they decide an expansion of 4 teams in 1970 for the 71 season. Oh, actually, it ended up only being 3 made it in because the Houston franchise that was going to be approved initially, they didn't have the money. So. And then in 72, there is a merger bill approved by a Senate committee, but it didn't really satisfy anyone. They determined the reserve clause couldn't be part of the merger, and a Senate subcommittee changed the terms. Even though it passed the lawmakers' test, the owners were not happy about it, and the players really weren't all that happy about it either. So that didn't happen. There was another attempt in 73 where the legislation was like, there's a SI Vault article from 72 kind of going through some of these issues. Larry Fleischer, who was the representative for the Players Union and a powerful agent of the time, really probably the most powerful player advocate, non-player player advocate of that time, basically said that they were okay, they would compromise and be okay with the merger if the owners would agree to get rid of the option clause, only actually have the option clause on rookie contracts, and also not allowing the idea of compensation, where the commissioner it would be enacted later, but compensation is basically a team loses a free agent, then the team that gets the free agent has to compensate them with basically an equivalent player. So it'd be basically forcing a trade. So obviously not true free agency. Most of the old line owners oppose this, but there are some signs that the younger ones could be on board. So there's some movement there, but obviously it's a long ways away.
Yeah, no, this is really a transition time in pro basketball. That era right around 72, 73, because the NBA, like you said, has an established league. There's tradition. There's the powerful Celtics teams. But between 1969 and 1973, 74, you have all of a sudden the retirements of a catalog of great players. The Bill Russell retires in 69, and then you've got a few seasons later, Wilt Chamberlain, Jerry West, Elgin Baylor, the Willis Reed, Jerry Lucas, Dave Debusschere. This whole cadre leaves, and now all of a sudden, and that some of those are as late as 74. But you've got this period of transition where the NBA had these established stars that we typically link to the 60s, and they've got the television contract, but their powerhouse teams are no longer powerhouses. And then the ABA, who's got this young, exciting talent that no one can watch on TV. And so this is to me, it's a pivotal moment of change in pro basketball. And it just so happens, of course, that at the time there's arguments about these two leagues merging or whatever the case is. And then, of course, the Senate's involved, the Robertson suit's taking place. So it's a fascinating 3 or 4 year window right there.
Yeah, and there's also a lot of the old line owners are going away and moving on to a new brasher class of owners, usually richer, usually having money and other things than basketball. Ned Irish of the Knicks is leaving around this time in the mid 70s. The Zollner of the Pistons is gone by the late 60s, early 70s, and some of the Jack Kent Cook is he came in the mid 60s, but he's another example of these kind of these brash big money owners. And also expansion brings a lot of owners to the club, and the ABA, all those guys are kind of crazy for the most part. So you have a different, there are different concerns now. There are, and TV, it can't be said enough how much television really started to really mean to the league. I mean, it was obviously the kind of the goal in the mid 60s to get a stable television contract that finally happens with ABC. Then they moved to CBS, which is even more prestigious station, although the treatment there isn't necessarily as good. But there's changes all sorts of kinds, beyond the players you're talking about. But there is definitely a new guard coming in both the ownership ranks and in the player ranks, as you're talking about. And 73, Mike Storin, who had been a Pacers general manager and Kentucky Colonels general manager, becomes the ABA commissioner, and after sort of a few years of, maybe a Cold War, more of a stalemate between the leagues, claims that the ABA is going to get aggressive again, pursuing players, trying to, the ABA's whole mission beyond the merger is to try to get a TV deal and and maybe establish itself as the second league, if the merger isn't going to happen, or at least, get itself in better position for the merger. But they also, they reinstitute a $300 million antitrust suit against the NBA. Also, there's talk of trying to put franchises in better TV markets, which, may or may not be a good idea depending on whether they can compete with the NBA teams there. And also they say they're going to go after established NBA players, which they largely stopped doing around 70-71. So and they also talk about chasing after Bill Walton. None of this really works out, but it's kind of a signal that at least the climate is changing, if nothing else.
The reigniting of that war by Storm in 74, I think obviously nothing really comes of it, but I think it does in some ways at least push NBA owners to again come back to the bargaining table.
Yeah, and then as you mentioned before, in 75, the Nuggets and the Nets attempt to apply to the NBA. That ended up being rejected, caught up in the legal system and stuff. They also try to bring in Kentucky Colonels as well, but owner John Y. Brown refuses to go along, shows loyalty to the ABA, at least for the moment. And that creates a lot of unease and bitterness for the system. The Terry Stembridge, who was a Dallas official later with the Spurs, he said, over the last two seasons, the ABA really lost that community spirit. The idea that they were, all the owners and all the players were kind of in the fight together, and there was very much a sense of, the franchises trying to help each other. If one team had rights to a player but couldn't sign them, they'd work out a deal where another team could get it, and there'd be competition. So there was a lot of brokering of deals to find good ownership for certain cities, even with ownerships of other teams. There was much more of a a camaraderie between the owners, and at least among that. That was somewhat lost. There was also new ownership that came late in the ABA. You guys who are looking to try to position themselves the best they can for a merger they feel like is coming, and sometimes that puts selfish interests over interests of a league that quite frankly looks like it might be dying.
Right.
And then February of 76, the Oscar Robertson lawsuit is settled. The option clause is abolished. Underclassmen could be selected in the draft officially. Now the competition does happen. Competition is established, but only for a few seasons. Actually, it was Jeff Mullins, who was a Warriors player and the head of the Players Union at that point, basically said that he decided they would give owners compensation for 4 years because that's about how long it would have taken the case to the Supreme Court. They compromise on that, and it's awarded through 79-80 season, and then compensation goes away, and it's more of a restricted free agency situation. Unrestricted free agency doesn't really come until 88 with Tom Chambers. And also, as a penalty for the reserve clause, the owners had to pay the players a certain amount of money as well.
I would love the compensation thing to be in place now, just because that would lead to fantastic Twitter conversations about what compensation package the Warriors would have to send to OKC for Kevin Durant, or I think free agency would be a lot more colorful with compensation.
Yes, yeah, it would. That would be pretty. That would obviously be pretty nuts. Kevin Pelton and I were talking about that and how that would certainly make his job much more interesting. And obviously, the players are better off without competition, but it is a weird landscape to think about because the compensation free agency really only lasted fully about 5 years, and then the restricted free agency, that was sort of a similar to competition because it essentially led to a lot of sign and trades. Moses Malone, for example, was a deal that in many ways was like competition, but was officially a sign and trade type thing. But
I think it's one of the most fascinating parts of breaks of the game is that compensation for Bill Walton signing in San Diego from Portland. So no, I think that was an important part of the merger, and something that I don't think talked a lot about, the end of the reserve clause and this beginning of free agency, and how in many ways basketball is kind of leading the way in a lot of ways in pro sports in America.
Yeah, it really does also, we'll get to it a little bit, but it creates kind of a wild off season in terms of, how teams respond to this once the merger actually does happen, and how like the Celtics, for instance, kind of make some, kind of head scratching moves, not paying Paul Silas, bringing in Sidney Wicks, and going kind of away from the way that they had done business for a long time, and kind of bringing in players that you didn't fit the previous Celtic mold, and the ups and downs that created up until Larry Bird came along. But one thing that I found interesting, there's a really good San Antonio Express news article talking about the merger, and Barry Robinson was a reporter there. He was the only ABA affiliated reporter who was in Hyannis for the merger talks, and this was during sort of the normal NBA owners meetings, and no one really. There was no prior sense, at least not publicly, that a merger was coming. Obviously, people knew the ABA was in trouble, and there was certainly the idea that things were struggling. But Robinson talked about how he was the only ABA affiliate reporter there. He was asked repeatedly by the NBA reporters, "What are you doing here?" And I'd always answer, "I'm here to cover the merger talks." And they would say, "There are no merger talks. There's nothing on the agenda about merger talks." And he kind of felt like the big city NBA reporters always looked down on the ABA reporters. We got very little respect, and it was sort of a typical behavior of the time. But I found it surprising that up until really the merger announcement itself, there may have been a leak here or two going on in probably some of the ABA cities, but it wasn't like well known going in ahead of time that ABA officials are in here at the NBA meetings, and they're at least discussing it. That was not really known beforehand on a wide scale in any case.
Well, I think part of that is the crying wolf is that they'd talked merger now for 6 or 7 years, and so at some point I think people stopped believing that it would actually take place.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and and obviously the secrecy would not be possible today, I don't think. But
no, definitely not.
Yeah, you're dealing with a different media environment, of course. There were lots of hurdles, really a lot of obstacles that really everyone had to go through to kind of get a settlement. There had to be 14 of the 18 NBA owners had to agree to the merger, and the Knicks owner Mike Burke had to be one of them because of the Nets invading their territory. It was pretty soon the NBA established that it would only take 4 teams, not 6. The ABA players wanted all the players to be part of the merger. The St. Louis owners desperately wanted to stay in the league. John Y. Brown, the owner of the Colonels, was fine with folding the team, and he made a pretty good deal that we'll talk about in a little bit. But there were, they had to get the, Larry Fleischer and the Players Union involved. And initially, the NBA owners wanted the ABA teams to pay a $4.5 million entry fee, which they thought was absurdly high. The ABA guys threatened another lawsuit, and there was, it looked like very close to the end that they probably weren't going to be able to make it through. Angelo Drosas, who was the Spurs owner there and was a powerful figure in the late stages of the ABA, basically said, he thought like, he told Larry O'Brien, the NBA commissioner, that, Uncle, we just can't do this. We're gonna back off and figure something else out. And really it was sort of an overnight thing. And one of the key moments, which I thought was a really interesting story, it was in the same San Antonio Express news piece that I had read before, is that the Nets owner Roy Bowe and Mike Burke, the Knicks owner, had an evening of drinks together, and they were obviously at odds because they both officially the Nets were rivals of the Knicks, although the Knicks still owned the town despite their struggles at that point, and the Nets had very little imprint despite having Julius Erving and despite having won 2 championships in the previous 3 seasons. But about 1 a.m. Wednesday in the bar, the two of them were laughing and joking and carrying on like long-lost friends. Bowe had his arm draped around Burke's shoulders, and it looked like anything but bitter business rivals. And Burke, after that decided to change his mind and support the merger, which is just an amazing, great 70s ownership story.
Absolutely. If it took place at the bar, that's quintessential 70s.
Yes, absolutely. So Dave Debusschere, he was the ABA commissioner at that point. Of course, it had been the great Knicks star. He came to the ABA first as the Nets GM and then moved on to become the ABA commissioner and was sort of, did most of the direct negotiating, although, the ABA officials that were their owners. Drosis has mentioned Roy Bowe, and also Carl Scheer, who was executive for the Nuggets, and the Pacers owners as well. But they were kind of a smaller part. They had not been in the league nearly as long, so they were kind of willing to go with whatever. But basically Drosis went to bed saying that like he didn't think it was going to happen. He thought it was over, but unbeknownst to him, in the morning the NBA owners had informally agreed to the merger. O'Brien was able to get it through, and the last thing was that Burke from the Knicks agreed to accept a payment of about $4 million from the Nets to settle the deal, and they agreed to a $3.2 million dollar terms for the 4 teams to get into the ABA, and also having to settle the paying off the Spirits and the Colonels owners, which we'll get to in a moment. But certainly there were a lot of things that could have scuttled that merger, and the fact that it went through was pretty amazing.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So the actual merger itself, it's announced June 17th, 1976. And as we mentioned, the NBA did not call it a merger. They called it an expansion. The NBA Board of Governors' final vote was 17-1 in favor of absorbing the 4 teams. Seattle actually registered the only no vote, which I kind of found funny because Sam Schulman was was a proponent initially of the ABA teams coming into the league. I don't know what happened 6 years later where he became such against it, but I found that was interesting. But some of the things, they couldn't receive any TV money for, I believe, 3 seasons. They missed the 76 drafts, which had happened a couple weeks before that, so they were unable to have the influx of talent. The owners of the Spirits, Daniel and Ozzie Silna, were given $2.2 million plus 4/7 of a team share of a TV contract, and this ended up being huge for them. They would earn $300 million through that through 2014, and then settled for a $500 million lump sum to end the deal, which was pretty incredible.
We talk about this as being maybe the greatest sports deal of all time, and Silna's really pulled the wool over their eyes. And even at the TV money wasn't big in the 70s, but even in the 70s, this was $500,000 a year. So this wasn't pittance in the 70s, and it just obviously it grew by leaps and bounds in the 2000s, and they're writing $20 million checks a year. But even then, I would love to be a fly on the wall to see how Danny and Ozzie Silna just could manage to make this work. But obviously they were dealing from a position of power, because their fellow ABA owners knew that they might not last another season, so they were going to get nothing out of it. But still, it was a pretty amazing deal.
The other guy who got a pretty good deal out of it, not quite as good as the Silnas, but John Y. Brown, who sold the Colonels took $3 million for folding the Colonels, and then very soon after bought the Buffalo Braves for $1.5 million, and then traded the Braves for the Celtics with Irv Levin. The Braves moved to San Diego, so John Y. Brown co-owned the Celtics for a while. He was eventually bought out. I can't find the exact figure he received for buying the Celtics, but I imagine he probably got more for the. I imagine he probably got a hefty profit out of the whole deal as well.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure John Y. Brown, profited from that little turn of events.
Yes. So, looking at like winners and losers when it comes to the merger, obviously, as we talked about the Silnas and John Y. Brown, I think were clear winners. The Nets, on the other hand, they and Roy Bowe, their owner, that's a little bit of a mixed, to say the least. They had to, as we mentioned, pay the Nets, pay the Knicks $4.8 million in territorial fees on top of the $3.2 million, which they had to pay for the entry fee. So they ended up selling Julius Erving to the 76ers for $3 million. He wanted to renegotiate his contract as well on top of that. They initially offered him to the Knicks for dropping the $480,000 annual charge, adding up to $4.8 million for 10 years, but they didn't accept that. So the Sixers got Dr. J instead, and things were better. he also, Roybo, ended up having major debts and had to sold the Nets and the Islanders, who he also owned, right away, like about a year afterward. The price is unknown for that, but unlikely given the debts that he had that he was able to really profit from this deal personally, although the future Nets owners, obviously, as the team's value increased, certainly benefited. The Pacers and Nuggets also a little bit mixed. The Pacers struggled financially after the merger. About a year later, they had to hold a telethon to sell 8,000 tickets, and if they had not been able to do that, they would have been sold to the highest bidder. Sam Nassi bought the team in '79 for an undisclosed price and then sold it for a reported, at least was asking for $4.5 million plus assuming $6 million in debts in 1983. In fact, was close to returning the team to the league that year. So, and then eventually, of course, famously, the Simons, who still own the team, bought the team and did well there. And Nuggets also struggled immediately after financially in the late 70s and early 80s. They were sold to a Spurs part owner, Red McCombs, who obviously sold his interest in these Spurs to buy the Nuggets for a reported $10 million in 1982. So, you know, those prices were raising by the early 80s, certainly more than the ABA owners had to sell the league, but with the amount of debt those teams probably were getting was probably a lot. But the Spurs owners did very well. Angelo Drosa said, hey, we paid dearly to get in, but he later sold his share of the Spurs for $47 million in 1988, and I think he said he got a $17 million personal profit out of that deal. So, by way, even though the owners had to pay quite a bit to get in, eventually those investments in those teams maybe didn't pay off for the initial guys, but certainly, those, as we know, owning the values of a sports team rarely go down.
Well, I think it's interesting how those ABA 4 kind of went different directions. So the Nets and Pacers sell off their star players, and the Nuggets and Spurs actually try to add more star power to their roster. So the Spurs end up getting Artis Gilmore in the early 80s, and the Nuggets, essentially gutted their roster to surround David Thompson and Dan Issel with star talent. They got traded for George McGinnis and Charlie Scott to try to increase the box office, because if you're not getting any money from television, the one way you can make money is to get higher attendance. And so the Nuggets were at the top or in the top 2 or 3 of attendance the last couple of years of the 70s, and really pumped money into that to make that happen, where the Pacers and Nets sold off everything that wasn't nailed down to try to make payroll.
The Nets had some benefit because they'd won a couple championships. So and the Pacers had obviously been established dynasties. So they had more stability in their previous regimes. The Spurs had only moved a couple of seasons before from Dallas, so they were fairly new as a successful team. And the Nuggets had mostly. We're mostly up and down until the mid-'70s, right before, they had a really great season with Mal Calvin, right before the season where they got Thompson and Issel, and really were peaking at exactly the right time for them to be attractive to the Nets. And the Spurs were trying to field a serious competitive team, wanting to be attractive in for the NBA. Theoretically, they were in St. Louis, which obviously a great television market, although it hadn't done well for the NBA previously. But as has been documented many places, they were just a disaster for the most part on the court. Marvin Barnes running amok, and were not a team that anyone had any interest in buying. Once they, once the time for the merger happened.
Well, once you got to the merger point too, they knew that the players were going to be dispersed, so there was no reason to buy the team if you could get the players you wanted. The Marvin Barneses and the Moses Malones that were on the Spirits.
Yeah, and the way the dispersal draft basically worked was, each ABA player was assigned a price for signing rights, and the funds were used to pay off debts from the ABA. Artis Gilmore was picked first by the Bulls, and his price tag was $1.1 million. Marvin Barnes was $500,000. He ended up, of course, washing out pretty quickly in the ABA. Moses Malone was $350,000, and he, of course, ended up being a great success, 3-time MVP, and lasting, playing for 20 years. Maurice Lucas, $300,000. And, he obviously helped lead the Blazers to the championship the very next season. So some great talent there. Then it got kind of thin after that as far as, major contributors. Most of the really good players, of course, were on the established teams. The weaker teams did not have as good of players for the most part. So yeah, it'd be interesting to wonder, if the merger hadn't happened, how we'd remember the ABA differently, because obviously most of the great players would have made it into the league, and Julius Erving would still have an impact. Julius Erving would still be remembered, but I do think the continuity of having the Spurs, Nets, Pacers, and Nuggets be part of the NBA, I do think helps keep that tradition alive more than it would have otherwise.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that if you ask, fan bases in those four cities, they still have pretty fond memories of the ABA. Definitely more so than places where the league folded. You still have, I know you've had several old Indiana Pacers players and reporters and them come on, and I think that universally talk about how beloved those early Pacers teams are. And I think that's only possible because that they can trace lineage directly back to those teams as opposed to the ABA folding. So I think the merger is incredibly important for the legacy of those four.
For those individual teams, it would be interesting to see. It would be interesting to look in the world to see how the ABA would be remembered in the other way. Although obviously, I think it worked out for the best for everyone involved. It is interesting how they're going to do a show in the future on how the ABA teams themselves sort of fared over the next few years. Obviously, as you allude to, the Spurs and the Nuggets did fairly well. The Pacers and the Nets struggled. Really, the Nets struggled for about 25 years before they, before they were able to right the ship in the early 2000s, and that only briefly. But anything else regarding the merger you think would be interesting to talk about?
No, I just think it's a fascinating event, definitely a turning point in pro basketball in the 70s. I think that you can trace a lot of very modern ideas about basketball back to the ABA and the merger. The idea of the high-flying wing players kind of taking a bit of the shine off the plotting low-post center action that the NBA was famous for. The emphasis on the dunk as an artistic shot, the three-point shot, the exciting up and down basketball that's played. I think a lot of these, the forerunners to kind of the styles that we like today, I think you could trace back to the NBA or the ABA, and the merger. So I think that this is an incredibly important event in the 70s certainly, and in pro basketball as a whole.
And you have a book about the 1970s coming out soon. You want to tell our listeners all about it?
Absolutely. It should be out early 2017. I'm sending final proofs off in the next couple of days. It's being published by Rowman and Littlefield, and the title is Tall Tales and Short Shorts, Dr. J, Pistol Pete, and the Birth of the Modern NBA. So I look at the NBA in the 1970s and trace its evolution, the great players, the great teams, the not-so-great players, and the not-so-great teams. And it's a fun ride. So I'm looking forward to seeing it in print, and it should be out, like I said, early 2017.
Thanks again to Adam for being on the show, and definitely check out his book when it comes out. It's going to be a great read, I'm sure. And thanks everyone for checking us out, and hopefully you've been enjoying our Basketball Mysteries in the 1970s series. You can find us on The Step Back at fansided.com, and also on iTunes and Stitcher, or wherever else you listen to your podcasts. Just search for Over and Back or The Step Back, and you can find it. And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at Over and Back NBA. So thanks for listening. We're back again soon.